Welcome back, everyone, to another Ask the Editor series. I am super excited to be here today with Euan Monaghan, editor of Structo Magazine. Welcome. How are you?
Very well, thanks a lot, and thanks for inviting me along.
Yeah, it's great to meet in person because we've corresponded for a couple of years through the review and about lit mags and other things. So it's lovely to finally meet.
Yeah, absolutely. I was trying to remember when it was, and it was a long time ago. I think our first connection. I can't remember.
Yeah. And welcome to everyone in the audience. As always, if you have any questions, just type them into the chat and I will do my best to work them into the conversation. So let's jump right in. Structo is, it's an online magazine and also a print magazine. And you are based in the Netherlands, but your editors are sort of spread out all over Europe. Is that correct?
Yeah, and beyond as well. But yeah, primarily in Europe.
Okay, and so the magazine started in 2008. Tell us why. Why start a lit mag?
Yeah, that's a fair question. It's an interesting one because I think a lot of people come to lit mags through the lit side. I really came to it through the mag side of things because during my undergrad I worked on the film magazine. And that kind of process of putting together a magazine with a group interested in producing a physical artifact that people can then go out and read was such a fun one. That when I left University of Kent in Canterbury, I felt a little bereft. It was so nice to have that kind of community of people around. And so, yeah, gradually in the year or so after that, I've always been really into literature. And yeah, I was thinking about ways to maybe bring a little bit of that back into my day-to-day, and not really knowing much about literary magazines, but being fairly aware of the zine scene and the kind of slightly more DIY side of things. There was not really any barrier there to just creating a magazine from scratch. Issue 1 was very much an A4 and stapled type thing. It's always been print first until very, very recently. And yeah, the issue 1 was basically me doing everything on the production side of things, including editing, and reaching out to people who I knew through from university or friends or whatever to kind of contribute. And it's just slowly grown from there in terms of adding people on board when it got to the stage when that was necessary, from copy editors, proofreaders, extra readers, and so on and so on. But really it was pretty much about the process of production and reading, rather than about the kind of traditional why you might produce a literary magazine. Otherwise, there's no ties to any organizations or institutions in that way.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So you didn't know that much about literary magazines when you started.
No.
What kind of research did you have to do to sort of catch up?
I think it's just been a very gradual process. That's something that is maybe a bit of a pattern with the magazine. There's until fairly recently, there hasn't been much stopping to think about what we're doing. A lot of it has just been heading in a vague direction of what we'd like to produce, and a product which is something which is high quality and producing good work and putting out good work and sharing it in a way which gets it read by people. And a lot of the stuff that we've kind of learned along the way has just been incredibly gradual. Whether it's from learning how to do distribution or get someone on board who can do distribution, learning editing, bringing on people who are very skilled in their particular style of editing. So a lot of that research just came from meeting people, or from talking to people, from reading the review, which was a fantastic resource for a long time in terms of connecting with that community, because the first issue was printed in Leiden in the Netherlands when I was over here on an internship. So I wasn't even in the country, never mind, I certainly wasn't connected with any kind of literary scene. And so it was kind of enabled by the internet, as many more modern literary magazines are, and in the sense that all the information is out there if you know where to look. So yeah, it's just been a case of, if we don't know how to do something, it's a case of finding someone who can tell us. You know, they're a very supportive community, or just looking it up.
I don't know if you can speak to this, but I'm curious, do you feel that there were any mistakes along the way? I'm always curious how entrepreneurs sort of handle this, you know, you're learning as you go. And I'm wondering if there were any moments where you realized like, oh, we totally did that wrong and we need to self-correct.
Yeah, good question. I don't think there have been any mistakes in the sense of problems that are needed fixing. There's been an enormous amount of iteration, which is something that I actually value incredibly highly, because the worst thing is being stuck in a way of doing things that isn't quite right, and feeling, you know, sunk cost fallacy approach of feeling like, hey, we have to do it this way because that's the way it's always been done. The only thing I can think of was there was one issue where we printed a lot more copies that ended up selling because we did we partnered with a festival, and then the festival got shifted in time. So then, but even then, that wasn't exactly under our control. So I don't think that could even count. So no, I don't think so. There have been many things that we've done a certain way and then changed to do a different way in one issue or two issue or however many issues time. And that's, I think, it's been course corrections, and the course has changed in the sense of, I mean, at the moment it's a very different time than when I was more involved with going to physical events and you know, physically talking to a lot of writers and holding events and launch parties. And so the way we do things now has to change. And I think everything has to be right for the moment and for the people involved, whether on the team or the writers, or especially the readers, I think, because I'm not a writer myself, I'm always looking at it from a reader's point of view. And all I'm just trying to produce is a magazine that I would want to read. It's a very selfish endeavor, really. Although, you know, one that takes a lot of effort. So no, I don't think any mistakes, at least none that I can remember. Maybe I've just blocked them out. I don't know.
That's interesting that you're not a writer, because I think most editors are also writers. So that's sort of, you have a interesting perspective that you're not actually sending out your work as well.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent that's helpful, because it's probably unhelpful in the way that I don't have, you know, I can't understand entirely what our what our contributors are, or the people submitting, how they're feeling, even emotionally when they submit their work. You know, obviously it's having talked to many writers and having lots of friends who are writers, I can understand from their point of view, hey, this is a big part of me that's coming out and potentially being rejected, for example. But I'm always, you know, we're trying to get this stuff read, and so if it's not going to be read in a way which is suitable for a reader, then what's the point?
Sure.
I mean, there's good arguments for art's sake, but that's not really what I'm interested in. Yeah.
So how would you describe the kind of work that you do publish?
Yeah, I'd be interested to know, and I've watched some of the other interviews, and you had kind of similar replies to the one that I'm going to give you, which is it's stuff we like, which is so massively unhelpful. I realize that, and I apologize. What I would say is, on the fiction side of things, there is a tendency towards stuff that plays with genre. We definitely have a foot firmly in literary fiction, but things like slipstream or the more character side of speculative fiction is something we're really interested in. I think you can probably get a good handle on it by looking at some of the people we've interviewed, actually. Just have it in front of me. I mean, people like I don't know, Margaret Atwood, Iain Banks, Ken Liu. It's people who are doing a shown Icelandic writer. Sometimes stuff which is maybe a little fable-like, but honestly, we've basically apart. We don't really do horror, but aside from that, we kind of take anything that's interesting, that has an interesting point of view that maybe we haven't seen before, or something that is just a really nice story, just told really well, which I appreciate isn't massively helpful. On the poetry side, my taste tends to be a little bit more straightforward than I think some more poetry focused magazines, but that is partly with me not being trained at all in poetry and just learning on the job, really. So I'm less experienced with the more experimental forms. I simply don't have the knowledge there to I certainly want to edit it, but to appreciate it, really. I mean, it's coming slowly. What I would say is that something that we do that many magazines don't. We have a focus on translation, works in translation, and that's both from fiction and poetry. We get a lot more traditionally in the poetry side of things, and that's partly because I had a poetry editor who, Matthew Landrum, who's a poet and a translator of poetry himself, who brought a lot of that with him. We were doing it before, but not to anywhere near the same degree as we did once he came on board. So yeah, I would say that that's broadly the kind of thing we do, but it's just anything with an interesting perspective, point of view, I suppose.
And do you publish theme issues?
No, we've never done that. I can totally see the value in that. It's just not something that we ever have done.
So what is your editorial process like? A story, a poem, and do you publish nonfiction essays as well? We
have done, yeah. We don't have an open call for it.
Okay.
But we have done.
Okay.
And we've had a few people doing semi-column type things, literary essays. Yeah, literary essays, I suppose. It's a bit ad hoc, but that's the whole magazine is a bit ad hoc, let's be honest. So the process. So we have an open call at the moment. So it's a little different than it was. So I say what it was previously and then explain maybe why we've changed it up. So previously we used Submittable. We've used it since it was Submishmash. I don't know if you remember. Remember Submishmash. So we were paying an astonishingly small amount of money compared to how much they charge now. And in fact, one of the reasons that we can pay authors now, even if it's a small amount, is dropping Submittable like a stone. And that covers a good chunk of the cost of paying authors for the issue. So we now have a kind of Google form set up, which requires a little bit more.
I sorry to interrupt. I'm just curious, can you tell us actually how much Submittable charges for lit mags? Because I think it would be good for.
I don't know how much they're charging now. Let's see. I forget. It was going to go up, it was going to add a 0 to the end of our monthly. Yeah. I forget the exact number, but it was hundreds and hundreds.
Yeah.
For it was hundreds per issue, which was that's nominally biannual.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like 500 or something. I forget the exact amount. It's very opaque, which is one of the reasons I have an issue with it. I can check the actual amount.
Okay. Thanks.
But yeah, it's I mean, I have my own problems with that way of working. They've pivoted as a company to taking submissions for jobs for companies and so on. They're just changing their business model, which is totally fine. But we've switched away now to Google Forms, which is actually quite a robust way of taking in submissions. And so those submissions will then be read by whoever on the team is reading at the time, which is the team varies in size. At the moment, it's I would say 6 or 7 people. We may be bringing some people in the next month or so. And we have some people who only work on fiction and some people who only work on poetry, but in general, we all look at everything. And then once one or two people, depending on their speciality, have looked at a piece, they will give it a vote or a rating. And then we'll kind of compile a long list and a short list, at which point we'll narrow it down to the actual issue's content. So for fiction, there will be, we generally don't take things which require any kind of substantive editing. Very occasionally, if there's something which is very blindingly obvious on the submission, in the acceptance, I'll say something like, we'd like to take this either way, however, maybe you lose the last paragraph or whatever it happens to be. Then once that's been formally kind of broad accepted, it'll go through copy editing, and then proofreading, and then it'll be printed. Or for the new issue, for issue 21, it'll go online first. For poetry, obviously it's slightly different. There's far less likely to be any edits made, in certainly no copy editing to speak of. Proofreading is still there, and it's just a lot lighter touch. Unless it's prose poetry, in which case there's maybe a little more back and forth there with copy editing. And it's something that I think we do really well. It helps that our proofreader and copy editor are both, we're both professionals in that work. So we do produce a really high quality end result, and I think a lot of our authors really appreciate that. So that's the way it kind of was, and we've adjusted it a little bit now to have each kind of part of the issue will be going online first. So there'll be a kind of weekly release schedule for 20 weeks, give or take, and then a print edition will become available. In the same way, essentially, as it exists at the moment, although changing format again, which is something that we do on a regular basis. A launch event, I forget where, we had someone come up and basically they really liked the magazine, but they were complaining that they were just on the shelf, they were just like this, because we changed size and we changed, we were a tabloid newspaper for 3 issues, which obviously is a nightmare if you need to shelve it. Right. So I mean, I can only apologize. But yeah, that's kind of the broad process, I would say.
So that's one of the recent changes, which is pretty exciting. You're going to start publishing a new story on the site every week. Yeah.
So starting February, there will be a weekly release schedule, either a story or a poem or some poems, or a collection of shorter pieces and then a longer piece. The shape of that is still a little in flux, in the sense of we're still building exactly what that looks like. We're trying to keep it as simple as possible. It's kind of weird because it doesn't sound like it, but actually this is all an attempt to simplify things. Because I think Structo has got, it's been around for a while, as you say. We founded in 2008. And it's just been kind of moving with its own momentum, and it's picked up a lot of pieces that maybe are unnecessary or just don't need to be the way they are. And so this kind of release schedule actually gives us, as the people working on the magazine who volunteer, all of us, just a lot more regular schedule and a lot more, especially for editing, copy editing and proofreading, a lot more sense of a regular schedule for when those edits can go and when they're going to be published, rather than having a little crunch towards an issue release, which could happen sometimes. Sure. So yeah, kind of aiming to simplify schedules some more.
And are the pieces, the fiction pieces, should they be shorter for the web version?
No, it's in fact, we put it up for the last issue from 3 to 4,000, and that's fine. Honestly, I don't have any problem with longer pieces online, partly because I kind of enjoy longer pieces online, but also because it's also going into print where longer form pieces perhaps sit more comfortably. It feels to me like it's the best of both worlds in that way, because perhaps some people don't like reading longer pieces online. Even if we produce a really nice, easy to read way of doing that, then that's fine. They can just get the print version. So there's no loss there. And as I say, I really quite like longer pieces. Yeah.
Sure. So do you ever come across a piece that you really like, but that doesn't feel right for Structo for some reason?
Yeah.
Is there some, I hate to use the word brand, but excuse me, I think it's helpful to think about if there is a certain kind of brand that you think of for the magazine. And if you encounter a piece that you really enjoy, but it's not quite right for what you're trying to put out into the world.
Yeah, completely. Often that's something which is perhaps a little too solidly in a genre. There might be a really, really beautiful piece of speculative fiction, for example, which personally as a reader, I really enjoy, but doesn't feel like something which, if I was purely a reader of Structo, it wouldn't be, it's not necessarily what I would be expecting. I mean, we like to surprise people, but there is a better venue for that. And there is a venue where the readers of that kind of work would be even more delighted to find it. Something like, some of the literary magazines that publish, for example, speculative fiction or sci-fi are some of the best paying journals around. So, often it's a case of, hey, this could probably do a lot better somewhere else in terms of readership. And, you could get some serious money for it potentially. So sometimes it's that, sometimes it's genre, sometimes it's voice. And this comes perhaps from the tastes of the readers and the editors who work on the magazine, but there is a very much I don't have the vocabulary for this, but a slightly staid, a very, very competently written piece, which might have, it reads like a story, capital S, and it's fine, it's great. It's not really doing anything interesting necessarily with character or plot or form or whatever. And there are readers who really enjoy that kind of stuff. And it's just that we're not the right place for it. And we're very honest in our feedback in the sense that we'll say to something like that, this is clearly well written. It's just unhelpfully not for us. And I think it's kind of fairly clear if people do look at the back issues. And I know it's easy to say that as an editor, take a look at some back issues, but I realize that people are submitting a lot of work out there and, trying to get their stuff published. So time is somewhat limited. But just looking at some of the work we published, there is usually something slightly unusual going on. But yeah, I would say the most often case for saying no to something that I really like is that the genre for it is a little too in one camp or another.
Okay, so either too much of a speculative story or too much of, in the States we usually call it like an MFA story where it feels incredibly
that's a really nice
competently crafted, but maybe lacking an element of spontaneity or certain kind of energy.
That's putting it really perfectly, and because we don't really have, I'm not in the UK, but in the UK we don't really have MFAs in that way. That is a really good frame of reference. And yes, 100%. Some of these people can write, no question, but they're not writing about something which is necessarily interesting to me as a reader of this magazine.
Sure.
It's a nice way to put it.
Can you give an example of a story that was recently accepted that you guys were just like, yes, this is why we got into this business. This is what we're all about. Yeah,
sure. Let me have a look at the last one. Well, I guess the one that stuck with me has stuck with me since. This is Structo 20. And there was a story in here by Hisham Bustani, who's a Jordanian writer and novelist. and translated from the Arabic by Thoraya El-Rayyes. And it's just really interesting. It's quite experimental in form, but it's just really interesting and very hard to describe, which is probably quite a good indication of something that is good for us. It doesn't make it easy to recommend to people, but it's a really incredibly atmospheric short piece, and it's beautifully translated. It almost didn't make it because we were hanging on. In fact, we delayed publication because we needed to clear some rights for a Wilfred Owen quote from the Wilfred Owen Association. This was in the middle of 2020, so understandably people weren't exactly responsive to emails. But they very kindly gave us permission, and it's a remarkable little story. This is all online now, so people can read it if they want to. It's hard to describe and quite remarkable. I always say with the stuff in translation, it shouldn't read like a translation, in the sense like that the language shouldn't be, you shouldn't be stumbling over it. But often stuff that comes through translation, the point of view is very different because it is coming from a different culture in that sense. And if you read this without the bit at the top that said translated from the Arabic by, you wouldn't know, which is fantastic. This is Field of Vision, which is in Structo 20, which if you go to the page on the website, you can click through to the issue page for the whole magazine, and it's fairly near the front.
Now you said it almost didn't make it. Can you say? Yeah,
so it almost didn't make it in because of the rights, because it has a fairly extensive quotation from Wilfred Owen.
I see.
Who was a First World War poet. And it was necessary. We couldn't cut it.
Oh, okay.
Even if we wanted to, we couldn't. And so it was integral to the piece. And so we try and do things as properly as we can. And so we wanted to clear the rights, and they were lovely. They just asked for a copy of the magazine, and that was everything. So.
Can you talk about submissions that you see that are absolutely not right for the journal? Like, are there things that you guys tend to get a lot of? Maybe people make assumptions because the magazine is based in Europe that there's, I don't know, a particular thing that you're looking for, or something that you see a lot of that you just want to tell writers, please, please stop. We don't do this. We don't, that's not what we're about.
Yeah. Weirdly enough, we don't really anymore. There used to be a lot of that. We used to get a lot of scattershot submissions. The kind of basically duotrope submissions, which duotrope is a fantastic resource. For those who, everyone knows presumably what duotrope is, but for those who don't, it's a directory of literary magazines. Is that fair to say? But what it does mean is that you can just send work without having considered whether it's the right place for it very, very easily. So we had a lot of those, which was stuff that was just, it was fine. And that takes up an enormous amount of time for a reader. Stuff that's bad is very easy to reject. It's very easy to notice from the first paragraph, or for a fiction, if it's just not well written or whatever. Average work is much harder and takes an enormous amount of energy and time. And so we introduced something for issue 15, I think it was, which was to ask those people who are submitting to include a photograph of a literary magazine that they've bought recently. And that just increased the quality of the work so incredibly dramatically. I'm always very aware of not wanting to be a gatekeeper, because that's the last thing. I'm just not interested in that. It's not why we got into this. So there is a little barrier there, but it's a barrier to stop those scattershot submissions. And my God, it worked incredibly well. We have now people who submit, there's just a kind of a pause before they have to do it, and makes them just stop and think whether they can be bothered to put in the effort to do this, to submit to Structo, which is what we want. We don't want to charge submission fees. We're not interested in that. But we do want people to make sure that they actually want to send it to us specifically. And it works. It worked so well. And we got some fantastic photos in, many pets, just, holding literary magazines. It was just fantastic. So, we in the past, we've gone through phases of getting stuff which is a bit dark, which we're not just dark for dark's sake, which we're not necessarily interested in, or whatever it happens to be. But we haven't been pigeonholed in the sense of a false idea of the kind of thing we publish. But I think your phrase of the MFA fiction is something that we get a lot of, and it takes up, I would say, the most of our effort and energy when we're reading, is making sure we're filtering that stuff out.
So to clarify, so when somebody submits a piece, they also need to include a photograph of a lit mag that they've recently purchased?
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
So can it be a lit mag that they've checked or they've read at the library, or?
Yeah. So So basically, yes. The idea is to just get work from people who are a little bit more engaged with the community. It has the added benefit of just making the standard of work that's coming in like skyrocket.
Really interesting.
Which is really interesting. I think it's probably just an effect of people who are a little bit more engaged, who perhaps not necessarily taking it more seriously, because there are plenty of writers who write in their spare time and are fantastic. But I think it's perhaps people who have maybe done a little bit more due diligence in terms of doing their research. They know that they've read a few magazines. And incidentally, we've all found so many interesting magazines through doing this, because the kind of people we see, when we see 5 or 6 of a certain magazine being included in that, like, so these people have read that magazine and they're now sending to us, what is this magazine? We've never heard of it. And then discover whatever it is, I don't know if you know Birkensnake in the US.
Yes, I've heard of it. Yeah,
it's a fantastically occasional literary magazine, which I love to bits, and we found out about it through having a bunch of people submit to us.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
What do you think is the overlap between the readership?
There's a lack of formality, I think. We're not affiliated to. We're kind of pretty independent by necessity, not by design necessarily. But we're not affiliated to any kind of university, or we don't get any outside funding. We're just kind of, I think there's a slight DIY aspect to the way we do things.
And so you guys, you've had a lot of recent changes. You've also recently transitioned to paying writers.
A little bit, yeah. Yeah, that's a little bit. It's partly due to dropping submittable that lets that be possible. It's partly because it's just valuing. It's just work. Fiction, poetry has value, and it's just making a gesture, at least in the first instance, towards that. Although doing the research for that was interesting, because I just assumed through naivety probably, that a lot of these larger markets that have been going for decades and decades paid reasonable rates. We are matching some of these places now, and we're only paying a tiny amount. It's astonishing that some of these places that also charge submission fees often pay so little.
Yeah.
So at least as a starting point, we are paying now, and honestly, we're partly because of moving the print edition to the end of the process, partly because we have dropped submittable. It's not changing our finances really at all. So it was something that I've been thinking about for a while, but I know my false assumption about what kind of rate is an insult was apparently way off. prevented that for a little while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing how many magazines don't pay writers at all, or pay a pittance.
Yeah, I mean, I understand they're not paying, especially if you're like a fully volunteer staff doing something not for profit, or making a loss. I think that's fine if you go into it honestly. That's totally legit. But when you see, I don't know, when you see magazines which have salaried employees charging submission fees, either not paying or paying a very, very small amount, it's surprising.
Sure. Speaking of finances, do you guys run any contests?
No, we don't. I mean, have we ever run anything like that? No, we don't. We've done bits and pieces here and there, usually in collaboration with other organizations. So arts festivals, things like that. But no, we haven't run our own. It's partly because we were all fairly busy with the stuff we do on the side. Although this is done on the side. Yeah, well, that says it all, doesn't it, really?
Right.
It's partly because it's a lot of work to run these things. And yeah, I don't know, it just has never felt like something we've needed to do. We do a lot of work to promote our writers, and it just never seemed. Yeah, other people were doing that fine. Yeah.
So what sort of things do you do to promote your writers? And do you find that it's a challenge being overseas? Do you feel like the bulk of the kind of lit mag readership and the lit mag scene is in the States, or have you connected with a community of readers and other editors where you are?
That's a really interesting question, because there's such a wider acceptance of literary magazines in the States, at least historically. That's changing. I would say that's changing. But because the magazine was started very, very small and has grown very gradually, it's just built very organically. Readers find us, and we're fairly visible now, I guess, among the kind of community of literary magazines. There is a really interesting group now of literary magazines and editors and writers and readers in the UK and Ireland and Europe more generally. I mean, especially since we started in 2008, and a bunch of magazines started around that time. But even since then, I mean, Scotland alone has kind of Gutter, Firewords. In fact, there's one in the last a year or two. Extra Teeth in Scotland is doing really interesting work, paying properly, just publishing really inventive, interesting work. Ireland has Gorse and The Stinging Fly. And England has a bunch of really nice ones as well, Neon and so on. I mean, also things like the White Review, which is it's a very different market. We're a bit more DIY than they are. They're very high end in their production values and their what they're aiming for. It's a lovely magazine. I mean, I have one here. In fact, they're lovely objects. So I think increasingly there is a readership, and there's things like Granta, which have been around for donkey's years. So there's definitely a readership there. It's just about connecting with them as someone who's not even based in the country where the kind of bulk of our readers are. And not that it matters so much these days, but having that kind of connection with a readership is really important. And so when we had launches, that was always really nice to actually meet some of our readers and contributors. But increasingly, having all of the online connections has been really nice. Honestly, I mean, I'm from the north of England, where I'm as far from London mentally as I was then. If in fact physically it's probably similar, but I feel more connected to the literary scene now than than 3 years ago.
Interesting.
That is to say, not very connected, but more connected than before. And actually, that's one of the reasons of going digital first from Structo 21 onwards, is to connect in a much, just removing that layer of friction between getting the work to the readers. Mm-hmm. Because that's something that, as much as I love print, and I'm a book designer, so I have to love print, getting the work in front of readers in a straightforward way has always been the goal. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so having it in a way which someone can literally just copy a URL and send it to their friend, it's going to be read by more people, so it's the way to do it.
Sure.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you have other things going on besides editing the journal. So I'm always curious how editors stay, what keeps you going with the magazine, what keeps you in the game, what keeps you excited about it?
It's always the writing that comes in. I always feel very, whenever we get a bunch of good submissions in, it's an incredibly kind of privileged position to be in. Because essentially you're just setting up a magazine, and then people send you cool stuff. Obviously, you have an enormous amount of work to get to that point. So energy comes from a bunch of places, and again, that's something why I've kind of restructured how we're doing things, because it's not. And we took the entire of last year off. We didn't publish at all, and that was deliberate. Partly because of the situation globally, but also because we needed to take a moment to stop and think about how to make this sustainable for us. Because no one makes money in literary magazines, and no one is necessarily trying to, I don't think, but it does need to be sustainable, emotionally, in terms of energy, in terms of, you name it. And so, part of it is from having a bunch of people on the team who are just interested, good people who are wanting to get cool writing out there. And I think everyone else on the team is a writer of some description, or it works in publishing. So everyone cares about the written word in that way. So that's really nice. But I think having, for example, a weekly release schedule, it stops it having that problem of publishing twice a year-ish, and then having a bump of enthusiasm when everyone's reading the magazine and getting interested and excited about things. And then it drops off again for 4 or 5 months when you're taking submissions, trying to balance all that with real life and so on. So having it at a much lower level, but a much more regular one, I think will hopefully make a big difference for kind of sustaining that energy over a longer period of time. But as I say, Structo has been very much an experimental project. And so if it doesn't work, we'll change it or we'll stop it. That was one of the options. That was one of the outcomes potentially of last year, was, do we stop? And that would have been fine. If that was the right answer, we would have stopped. Because if it wasn't giving us what we wanted, then there's really no point in continuing, because partly because if someone else is doing it better, I'd rather just read that magazine. I genuinely would. Yeah, right. So but looking at it, we're like, okay, no one is doing what we're doing. Let's try and do that better.
Right.
But yeah, it's always been a hugely iterative process, which I know I say a lot, but it is true. And it's a really nice way to approach things. So it's fun.
So we have a question here from Dan. Thanks, Dan. 2 questions, actually. The first, have you ever been tempted to take the magazine into that kind of bigger institutional route, or do you see the magazine remaining independent and sort of smaller and more flexible?
Yeah, I don't know if anyone would take us, to be honest. Genuinely. But no, I think the fun thing about it is the independence. We don't have to consult anyone to do what we want to do. I don't think many organizations would say, yeah, it's okay, you can have whatever 14 months off not doing anything, and that to be okay without having to consult some committee. Or I think that flexibility and freedom is something I value enormously, for the magazine especially, because it's a project which is there to produce a magazine and to get interesting work out there. That is basically the only thing. If we're doing that, then that's great. And how we do it doesn't really matter. And that flexibility I value enormously. Yeah, that makes sense. And the other question is related to diversity and representation, which is sort of an issue for lit mags across the board. But so Dan says he's a long-time submissions reader for another UK magazine. And the submissions do seem to be predominantly white, upper middle class, postgrad, MFA educated, etc. So have you encountered that? And how do you think lit mags can improve access and champion underrepresented voices? Yeah, I mean, 100%. It's incredibly interesting, this, and it's really, really hard. And that is not a reason not to do it. So we read as blind as possible, first of all. Most people put their name on their Word document, so it doesn't necessarily, you can't ignore, there are some unconscious biases which I'm sure are being made there. What we do, though, is to do a bunch of retrospective looks at things like, so I don't know if they're still doing the Vida count, which was really made quite a big impact on magazines, journals looking at the gender split between who they, I don't know if it was whether it was submissions versus published, or whether it was just how many men, how many women, how many non-binary people they publish. But we look pretty deeply into that data. I'm actually a scientist by training, so I'm happy to dive into data every now and again. And that was really nice, because in terms of gender, at least, we didn't have an issue there. It's fairly evenly split, both in terms of submissions versus published authors. In terms of reaching out to underrepresented groups, that is really, it's tricky. Part of it is about being accessible, and that's another reason why we've gone online, because literary magazines, we love them, but they're incredibly niche. Many people don't even know that that's a thing. And so instead of being a magazine first and then a PDF of a magazine or a website or a URL on issue, where you'd have to actively seek out a literary magazine, if instead we can be a interesting story on a website first, perhaps that's all it is to some people, that A is free. B, it just takes sending someone a website link. So I think that for me was a big part of it, because if you require access to, I don't know, an independent newsagents or bookshop which stocks literary magazines, you're already cutting out a lot of potential for really interesting stories, for really interesting points of view. And so, we donate magazines to places where we can reach some people who we wouldn't ordinarily reach through kind of normal platforms. But there's no way that's going to come anywhere close to being online first, at least. And so that's a big part of it. But I think it's just about being open to being wrong, in the sense of, are we doing something that isn't helping us find people with interesting points of view? And usually they are underrepresented people, right? Whether it's people from non-English language speaking countries, which is to say almost everyone on the planet, or it's people from a certain ethnic group, or whatever it is. there are interesting underrepresented stories there. So it's really dumb not to actively seek those out. And yeah, at least the next step in that direction of finding good stories is, for me, about making the work that we publish already more visible to everyone. So we'll just capture a larger group of people in general. But it's a really good question. And you can look at it from a point of view of being inclusive, which it is. But from a purely selfish point of view, you can look at it as just a way of finding really, really interesting writing. Because we've been publishing as in the literary magazine, not community, but historically, have been publishing kind of by white men for such a long time. We've heard many of the stories, right? And so there's so much interesting work out there. And I'd quite like to read it, I guess. Yeah, so it's just about putting in a bit of legwork, really.
Do you solicit work from writers?
Very occasionally. And it usually just gets chucked into the, would have been submittable previously, but it usually just gets submitted along with everything else. So the readers won't necessarily know who it is. We don't, at least we haven't historically taken anything and said, yeah, we'll publish what you send us. That's not really what we're interested in. I've definitely asked people to send us stuff plenty of times. And I don't think anything has ever bypassed the first readers, in the sense of, because there's no there was a point, I think, one of our fairly early issues where we turned down someone who was published by one of the big publishing houses. And it was actually really helpful because it just wasn't very good. And it was kind of a moment when we were like, oh yeah, we're not trying to, no one else is going to buy a literary magazine because it's got someone's name on it. Really, that doesn't really make a difference.
Right.
And so if we focus on just publishing good work, it doesn't really matter who it's from. It'll get a few more shares on Twitter or whatever, but even then, not really.
And are you guys ever looking for readers, volunteer readers? Is there a way for people to get more involved with the magazine?
Yeah, if anyone's interested, feel free to email me. I sent out a newsletter around Christmas time, just with a little update. And we had a call for a proofreader in there, and got some ridiculously well qualified people. At least, and I'm definitely, whoever isn't going to end up doing some proofreading for us, I'd like them to read for us at least. We're kind of, I've tried to make the hierarchy as flat as possible, partly because I really hate managing, but also because I don't think it's helpful. And so many people in the magazine work on kind of different random things, or have gone on to do different things. I mean, the first book we published from the press was translated by someone who used to be a reader for us, which is translation of Juan Rulfo's short story collection from the 50s. So he was a reader. Stephen Beechnor was a reader for us back on the early days, and then he went away to write for himself and do his work for a long time, and then came back and did this. So yeah, people kind of move around and do things that they're good at within the magazine as an organization.
Okay, so people should email you if they're interested.
Yeah. We may not need anyone in the short term, depending on how many of the people who emailed for the proofreader position are interested. But yeah, I mean, we don't have we're just generally open to people who are interested in the stuff we do, kind of independently minded.
Yeah, great. So what's on the horizon for you guys? You have submissions are open now and until when? Until
the end of January.
Oh, okay.
Historically we've had a lot of submissions, and we previously were usually open for about 5 weeks for each issue, and it was a lot. It was a lot to get through. The adding the literary magazine picture things, reduced that amount, but didn't reduce the amount of good stuff. So it still takes quite a fair amount of time. In the kind of short term, it's actually relatively quiet time for me on the magazine when submissions are open, because we don't have to do a lot of the shortlisting or long listing in the kind of open period. But we're working a lot on the press side at the moment. We have we have a couple of books, kind of one out now-ish. A lot of this stuff has been caught up in all the publishing supply chain issues that's going around. But we have our next kind of book in translation out on the 24th of January, which is this one, which is really nice. It's beginning to get a bit of buzz. It's a translation from the Spanish by a Spanish author called Lara Moreno, translated by Katie Whittemore. It's a novel called Wolfskin. Really, really fantastic. So that's been taking up a lot of time on that side of things. On the magazine, it's more about getting the structures in place for the digital first side of things, which is actually relatively straightforward. But we're just iterating and playing and trying to figure out the best way to do it, at least for now.
That's great. So for people to submit and to check out past issues, they should go to structomagazine.org,
structomagazine.co.uk.
Okay.
Or just Google Structo Magazine.
Structo Magazine. And you are active on Twitter?
I kind of come and go, but feel free to engage. Yeah.
Sure. I don't think I've talked to a single editor who fully knows their own Twitter account.
That's fair.
So you're Structo at Structo Magazine.
Structo Magazine on Twitter, Structo Press on Instagram, because that's for both really. I delightedly closed our Facebook account towards the end of last year, partly because it wasn't sending out any of our updates to the thousands of people who had liked the page without paying them, partly because it's Facebook. So it's nice, but it's part of this whole process of consolidating and just applying energies to things that actually make a difference.
Yeah, of course. Makes sense. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. This was really instructive and helpful.
You're welcome. Thanks a lot for having me on. It's really nice, and it's really nice to watch the other interviews as well. There's some really cool stuff there.
They're a lot of fun. Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for coming out today. This is great. I will do the write-up and send it to you shortly.
Great. Thanks so much.